The Pentagon called them filthy pigs. American generals laughed at their primitive tactics. They mocked the Australians for crawling through mud while America brought the thunder of B-52 bombers and helicopter gunships. But then the classified reports started coming in. And suddenly, nobody in Washington was laughing anymore. What you are about to hear is a story that the United States military tried to bury for decades. A story so embarrassing, so damaging to American military pride, that it was classified at the highest levels and hidden from the public. How did a handful of Australian farmers and surfers outperform the mightiest military machine in human history? How did they lose only 7 men in an entire decade of combat, while American special forces lost thousands? And why did the Pentagon desperately try to cover up what they discovered? The Viet Cong had a name for these Australians. They called them Ma Rung, the Phantom Soldiers, the Ghosts of the Jungle. Enemy commanders issued orders to avoid them at all costs. Entire units refused to enter their territory. And when American observers finally witnessed their methods firsthand, what they saw changed everything they thought they knew about warfare. 7 men. That is all they lost. 7 men in 10 years of the most dangerous operations imaginable. The kill ratio was so extraordinary that Pentagon analysts assumed the reports were fabricated. They were not. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to reveal will shock you. The methods they used, the secrets they kept, the cover-up that followed. All of it comes out today. This is the true story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. And trust me, you have never heard anything like it. The year was 1967, and deep within the air-conditioned corridors of the Pentagon, a group of senior American military analysts gathered around a conference table covered with classified reports from Southeast Asia. The documents they were examining contained statistics so absurd, so seemingly impossible, that several officers openly laughed. One colonel, a veteran of Korea with 3 decades of service, reportedly tossed the papers aside and muttered the words that would echo through military history. "Look at those filthy pigs, wallowing in the mud while we bring the thunder." He was referring to a small contingent of Australian soldiers operating in Phuoc Tuy province. Men who moved through the jungle without the massive artillery support, the helicopter gunships, the B-52 strikes that defined American warfare. These Australians carried minimal ammunition, wore boots they had deliberately mutilated, and sometimes spent 10 consecutive days in enemy territory without firing a single shot. To the Pentagon brass, accustomed to the doctrine of overwhelming firepower, these tactics seemed primitive, almost embarrassing. But the numbers on those classified reports told a different story entirely. And within months, the laughter in Washington would turn to stunned silence, then to urgent classified inquiries, and finally to a cover-up that would last for decades. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare for Pentagon planners. The first Australian SAS soldiers arrived in Vietnam in 1962, years before the major American buildup transformed the conflict into a full-scale war. They came not as liberators with trumpets blaring and flags waving, but as shadows slipping quietly into a country that would test everything they thought they knew about combat. The initial contingent numbered just 30 men, a laughably small force compared to the hundreds of thousands of American troops who would eventually flood the region. These early arrivals established their base at Nui Dat, a small hill in Phuoc Tuy province that American planners considered strategically insignificant. The Americans had chosen the coastal areas and the approaches to Saigon, the glamorous assignments where careers were made and medals were won. They left the Australians with what appeared to be a backwater, a quiet sector where nothing important would ever happen. But the Australians saw something different in that jungle-covered terrain. They saw an opportunity to wage war on their own terms, using methods that would have horrified their American allies if anyone had bothered to pay attention. The first clue that something unusual was happening came in 1966, when American intelligence officers began noticing strange patterns in enemy movement around Phuoc Tuy province. Viet Cong units that had operated freely throughout the region were suddenly changing their routes, avoiding certain areas entirely, and reporting mysterious losses that they could not explain. Captured documents revealed something remarkable. The enemy had begun calling the Australian sector cursed ground. And yet, the most disturbing revelations were still to come. To understand what made the Australian SAS different, you must first understand what made the American approach to Vietnam fundamentally flawed. The United States military had emerged from World War II and Korea as the most powerful conventional fighting force in human history. American generals believed in firepower and technology, in the overwhelming application of force that had crushed Nazi Germany and pushed the Chinese army back across the 38th parallel. When these generals looked at Vietnam, they saw a problem that could be solved with more bombs, more helicopters, more troops, and more ammunition. The philosophy was simple. Find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior firepower. It was a doctrine that had worked brilliantly against conventional armies fighting conventional wars. But Vietnam was not a conventional war, and the Viet Cong were not a conventional army. They melted into the jungle after every engagement, emerging from tunnels and spider holes to strike when least expected, then vanishing again before American artillery could zero in on their positions. The more firepower America applied, the more civilians perished, the more villages were destroyed, and the more recruits flocked to the communist cause. The Australians watched this cycle of destruction with growing alarm. Many of them were veterans of the Malayan Emergency, a brutal 12-year campaign against communist insurgents in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Malaya, they had learned lessons that the Americans either did not know or refused to accept. The most important lesson was this: in jungle warfare, stealth defeats firepower every single time. But the Pentagon was about to learn this lesson the hard way. The Australian approach to Vietnam began with a radical reimagining of what special operations should accomplish. While American units measured success in body counts and enemy contacts, the Australians measured success in intelligence gathered and operations completed without detection. Their philosophy could be summarized in a single phrase that became their unofficial motto: "We are not here to fight. We are here to win." This distinction might seem subtle, but its implications were revolutionary. American special forces like the Green Berets and the Navy SEALs were trained to engage the enemy aggressively, to seek out contact and destroy hostile forces through superior training and firepower. They were warriors in the traditional sense, men who proved their worth through combat. The Australian SAS rejected this entire paradigm. They trained their operators to view combat as a failure, a breakdown in the primary mission of gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations through psychological warfare. A perfect patrol, in Australian doctrine, was one where the enemy never knew you were there until long after you had gone. But this did not mean the Australians avoided violence. Far from it. When they did engage the enemy, they did so with a ferocity and precision that shocked everyone who witnessed it, including their American allies. What happened next would change everything the Americans thought they knew about warfare. The first American Special Forces operator to embed with an Australian SAS patrol was a Navy SEAL lieutenant whose name remains classified to this day. He arrived at Nui Dat in early 1967, sent by his superiors to observe Australian methods and report back on whether their rumored effectiveness was genuine or merely the product of inflated statistics and favorable terrain. What he witnessed over the following weeks would fundamentally transform his understanding of warfare. And his classified after-action report, portions of which were finally declassified in 2003, provides the most detailed American account of Australian SAS methods during the Vietnam War. The lieutenant arrived expecting to find a professional military unit operating according to familiar principles. Instead, he found something that seemed almost alien in its approach to combat. The Australians did not maintain the rigid protocols and chain of command structures that defined American special operations. They operated in small teams of 5 to 6 men who moved through the jungle like a single organism, communicating through hand signals so subtle that the American initially could not even perceive them. But the first shock came when he observed their preparation for a patrol. The Australians spent hours methodically destroying their own equipment, or so it appeared. They took brand new jungle boots and deliberately cut the soles, creating irregular patterns that would leave prints indistinguishable from the sandals worn by Vietnamese peasants. They removed all insignia, all identification, anything that could mark them as Western soldiers if their bodies were ever found. When the lieutenant asked about this practice, the patrol leader, a laconic sergeant from rural Queensland, simply shrugged and offered an explanation that revealed the fundamental difference in philosophy. The Americans, he said, want the enemy to know they are coming. They want the enemy to be afraid of American power. We want the enemy to never know we exist until we choose to reveal ourselves. And when we do, we want them to believe that ghosts are hunting them. Little did the lieutenant know he was about to witness those ghosts in action. The patrol departed Nui Dat at dusk on a Tuesday, moving into jungle so dense that visibility dropped to less than 3 meters within the first hour. The American lieutenant, despite his extensive training, immediately struggled to keep pace. The Australians moved through the vegetation without seeming to touch it, their passage leaving no bent branches, no disturbed leaves, no evidence that human beings had ever walked that path. By contrast, the lieutenant felt like he was crashing through the undergrowth like a wounded elephant. Every step seemed to snap a twig, rustle a leaf, or disturb the countless insects that swarmed through the humid darkness. The patrol leader silently corrected him dozens of times during that first night, demonstrating techniques for placing his feet, for distributing his weight, for moving through vegetation rather than against it. The Australians had learned these techniques from the men who invented them. Aboriginal trackers who had been hunting across the Australian outback for 40,000 years. These indigenous Australians possessed knowledge of tracking and stalking that no Western military training could replicate. Some served directly with the SASR units in Vietnam, while others had trained the operators during the brutal selection courses back home. The lieutenant later wrote that watching an Aboriginal tracker work was like watching a different species of human being, one that had evolved specifically for the jungle environment. They could detect signs of enemy presence that remained completely invisible to Western eyes. A slightly discolored leaf, a pattern of insect activity, the barely perceptible scent of rice cooking from kilometers away. But the true test of these skills was only hours away. For 3 days, the patrol moved deeper into enemy territory without making contact. They covered ground at a pace that would have seemed impossibly slow to American commanders obsessed with metrics and measurable progress. Some days they traveled less than a kilometer, pausing for hours at a time to observe, to listen, to absorb the rhythms of the jungle around them. The lieutenant grew increasingly frustrated. His training emphasized action, initiative, the aggressive pursuit of enemy forces. This passive creeping through the undergrowth felt like cowardice, like a waste of the considerable skills these men clearly possessed. On the 3rd night, he finally voiced his concerns to the patrol leader. The sergeant listened patiently, then posed a question that the lieutenant would remember for the rest of his life. He asked how many enemy soldiers the American had observed during their movement. The lieutenant admitted he had seen none, had detected no signs of enemy presence whatsoever. The sergeant nodded slowly, then revealed the truth. They had passed within 50 meters of at least 3 Viet Cong positions during the previous 2 days. They had observed enemy supply movements, identified a previously unknown weapons cache, and located the entrance to a tunnel complex that American forces had been searching for since 1965. They had gathered enough intelligence to justify a major operation. And they had done it without the enemy ever knowing they were there. The lieutenant sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. American patrols crashed through the jungle, announcing their presence to every enemy unit within miles. They walked into ambushes, triggered booby traps, and fought desperate battles against enemies who always seemed to know exactly where they would be. Meanwhile, these Australians moved like smoke through the same terrain, seeing everything while remaining invisible. But the real lesson was still to come. On the 4th day, the patrol located its primary target, a Viet Cong supply depot hidden beneath the jungle canopy. American doctrine would have called in an airstrike, obliterating the target with high explosives and announcing American presence to every enemy unit in the province. The Australians had different plans. They established observation positions around the depot and waited. For 2 full days, they watched, cataloging every movement, every supply shipment, every face that passed through the area. They identified the depot commander, mapped the defensive positions, and noted the times when security was weakest. Then, on the 6th night, they struck. What happened next would haunt the American lieutenant for decades. The assault was so swift, so silent, and so utterly devastating that the lieutenant struggled to process what he was witnessing. The Australians moved through the enemy camp like phantoms, eliminating sentries with methods that made no sound whatsoever. Within 8 minutes, they had neutralized the entire depot garrison, more than a dozen enemy soldiers, without firing a single shot. The lieutenant had been trained in close-quarters combat by some of the finest instructors in the American military. He had believed himself to be among the most lethal hand-to-hand fighters in the world. But watching the Australians work, he realized he was witnessing an entirely different level of capability. They did not fight the enemy so much as disassemble them, using techniques that seemed to require almost no effort, yet proved instantly incapacitating. Before withdrawing, the Australians performed a ritual that the lieutenant found deeply disturbing. They arranged several of the enemy remains in specific positions, creating a tableau that was clearly intended to send a message to whoever discovered the scene. When the lieutenant asked about this practice, the patrol leader simply stated that the Viet Cong would understand, and that understanding would spread fear throughout their ranks faster than any American bomb. The psychological warfare had begun, and its effects would prove more devastating than any weapon in the American arsenal. The patrol returned to Nui Dat 7 days after departure, having covered more than 40 kilometers of enemy territory, gathered intelligence on multiple, high-value targets, and eliminated an entire enemy depot without suffering a single casualty. The lieutenant submitted his classified report within the week, and its contents quickly escalated to the highest levels of the Pentagon. The statistics he reported seemed impossible. The Australian SAS was achieving kill ratios that exceeded anything in American special operations by a factor of 10 or more. They were operating continuously in enemy territory with casualty rates that approached zero. And they were gathering intelligence of such quality that American commanders were beginning to rely on Australian reports more than their own reconnaissance. But it was the methods, not the statistics, that truly alarmed the Pentagon analysts. The Australians were employing psychological warfare techniques that violated both the letter and spirit of the Geneva Conventions. The body arrangements, the deliberate cultivation of supernatural fear among the enemy, the integration of aboriginal tracking methods that seemed to cross the line into something darker. These practices could never be officially acknowledged by the United States military. And yet the results were undeniable. In a war where American forces were struggling to achieve any measurable progress, where body counts were routinely fabricated and victories claimed for battles that changed nothing, the Australians were systematically destroying enemy capability in their sector through methods that cost almost nothing in lives or resources. The Pentagon faced an impossible choice, and what they decided next would shape the war for years to come. They could acknowledge Australian superiority and attempt to adopt their methods, which would mean admitting that American doctrine had failed and that techniques violating international law were more effective than conventional warfare. Or they could classify the findings and pretend they did not exist. They chose the second option. The cover-up began almost immediately. American observers embedded with Australian units were reassigned. Reports detailing Australian methods were classified at the highest levels, and a quiet campaign began to minimize Australian contributions to the war effort, ensuring that the American public would never learn how badly their military had been outperformed by a handful of soldiers from a country with less than 1/20th of America's population. But the truth could not be entirely suppressed. Within the Special Operations community, word spread about the Ma Rung, the phantom soldiers of the Australian SAS. American operators who had witnessed their methods returned to their units with stories that seemed too incredible to believe. And slowly, elements of Australian doctrine began infiltrating American special operations, though the source was never officially acknowledged. The Australians themselves seemed uninterested in recognition. They continued their patrols, continued their quiet war of shadows and psychological terror, continued achieving results that defied everything the American military believed about warfare. And the numbers they compiled would become the stuff of legend. Over the course of the entire Vietnam War, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment lost only 7 men to all causes: combat, accidents, illness, and friendly fire combined. 7 men, total, from a unit that spent years operating continuously in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. To put this number in perspective, American Special Operations units routinely suffered more casualties in single operations than the Australians lost during the entire conflict. Navy SEAL teams, Army Special Forces, Marine Force Reconnaissance, all of these elite units paid a far higher price in blood for far less measurable results. But the single most remarkable statistic was this. Throughout the entire war, only one Australian SAS soldier was confirmed to have been ended by enemy action in direct combat. One man. Sergeant David Fisher, who served with distinction until his patrol was ambushed in 1969. For years, he was listed as missing in action, his fate unknown. But that single, confirmed combat loss, against hundreds of enemy eliminated, represented a kill ratio that no military unit in modern history has ever approached. The breakdown of those 7 losses tells its own story. One man fell in direct combat. 1 passed from wounds received in an earlier engagement. 3 were lost to accidents, including what military terminology euphemistically calls friendly fire. 1 was taken by illness. 1 was listed as missing in action, his fate unknown for years. These numbers would seem remarkable for a rear echelon unit that never saw combat. For an elite force that spent years conducting the most dangerous operations imaginable, they border on the miraculous. But how did they achieve the impossible? The answer lies in secrets that the Pentagon tried desperately to bury. The secrets of Australian SAS success were rooted in factors that American military culture could not easily replicate. The first was institutional memory. Unlike the American forces, which rotated individual soldiers through Vietnam on one-year tours, the Australians deployed as intact units with soldiers who had trained together for years. They knew each other's movements, each other's capabilities, each other's reactions under stress with an intimacy that created almost telepathic coordination in the field. The second factor was their experience in Malaya. The Australian military had spent more than a decade fighting communist insurgents in jungle terrain before Vietnam, developing techniques and doctrines specifically suited to that environment. They understood, in ways that American commanders never fully grasped, that conventional military power was not merely ineffective in jungle warfare, but actively counterproductive. The third factor was the integration of Aboriginal knowledge. The Australians had access to 40,000 years of accumulated wisdom about tracking, stalking, and survival in harsh environments. They used this knowledge shamelessly, adapting ancient hunting techniques to the pursuit of human prey. American forces had nothing comparable. Their indigenous tracking traditions had been largely destroyed during the conquest of the American West. But perhaps the most important factor was philosophical. The Australians approached Vietnam not as a war to be won through firepower, but as a problem to be solved through intelligence. They did not seek to destroy the enemy through overwhelming force. They sought to understand the enemy so completely that destruction became almost incidental, a surgical removal of threats rather than the wholesale slaughter that characterized American operations. This philosophy would prove devastatingly effective in ways that no one anticipated. The impact of Australian methods extended far beyond their immediate tactical successes. Captured Viet Cong documents revealed the depth of fear that the Ma Rung had instilled throughout enemy ranks. Communist commanders issued specific orders about avoiding the Australian sector, warning that the phantom soldiers could not be fought using conventional guerrilla tactics. One captured directive, translated and analyzed by American intelligence in 1968, provided explicit instructions for dealing with Australian patrols. The enemy was ordered to avoid contact at all costs, to withdraw immediately if Australian presence was suspected, and to report any sighting through the chain of command rather than attempting engagement. This was the exact opposite of the aggressive posture that Viet Cong forces maintained against American units. The psychological warfare components of Australian operations proved particularly devastating to enemy morale. The body arrangements, the silent eliminations, the cultivation of supernatural fear. All of these elements combined to create an image of the Australians as something more than human, something that could not be fought with guns and grenades. This psychological impact multiplied the effectiveness of the tiny Australian force many times over. Every Vietnamese peasant who heard stories about the Ma Rung became a potential source of intelligence, willing to share information with forces they believed might protect them from the ghosts. Every Viet Cong soldier who learned of the phantom soldiers became slightly less aggressive, slightly more cautious, slightly more likely to avoid confrontation. And all of this was achieved with a force that never exceeded more than a few hundred men at any given time, operating on a budget that would have been a rounding error in American military spending. The enemy had learned to fear the darkness itself, but the Australians were just getting started. The operational doctrine that emerged from Australian training was unlike anything in the Western military tradition. American special forces were taught to be aggressive, to seek out and destroy the enemy through superior skill and firepower. The Australians were taught to be invisible, to accomplish their missions without the enemy ever knowing they had been there. This difference in philosophy manifested in every aspect of their operations. American patrols moved quickly, covering ground efficiently but noisily, trusting in their superior firepower to deal with any contact. Australian patrols moved slowly, sometimes covering less than a kilometer per day, sacrificing speed for absolute concealment. American forces called in artillery and air support at the first sign of enemy presence, advertising their location to every hostile unit within range. Australians avoided contact whenever possible, engaging only when they held overwhelming tactical advantage, and then withdrawing immediately rather than pressing their success. American units measured success in body counts, often inflated, that fed the statistical hunger of commanders back in Washington. Australians measured success in intelligence gathered, operations completed without detection, and enemy morale degraded through psychological operations that left no bodies to count. The results spoke for themselves. American units walked into ambushes with depressing regularity, suffering casualties that accomplished nothing beyond adding to the growing list of names on the wall that would eventually be built in Washington. Australian units almost never walked into ambushes because they detected enemy presence long before contact was made, and they either avoided the trap entirely or turned it against the ambushers. But the contrast between the two approaches would soon become impossible to ignore. The contrast between American and Australian approaches was nowhere more evident than in the matter of equipment and logistics. American Special Operations Forces went into the field equipped with the finest gear that unlimited defense budgets could provide. They carried automatic weapons with ample ammunition, communication equipment that connected them to artillery batteries and air support, rations designed to sustain them through any operation, medical kits prepared for every eventuality. The Australians went into the field with dramatically less. They carried minimal ammunition because they did not expect to engage in sustained firefights. They carried minimal food because they expected to forage from the jungle and from enemy supplies. They carried minimal equipment of all kinds, because every ounce of weight reduced their mobility and increased the signs of their passage. Most striking was their deliberate mutilation of standard equipment. They cut the soles of their boots to leave prints that would be mistaken for Vietnamese sandals. They removed all insignia and identification that could mark them as Western soldiers. They even modified their weapons to eliminate any sound or flash that might reveal their position. This approach horrified American quartermasters, who had been trained to believe that military effectiveness was directly proportional to the quantity and quality of equipment issued to troops. But the Australians understood something that their allies did not. In jungle warfare, less was very often more, and this principle would prove itself again and again in the months ahead. The small unit tactics employed by Australian patrols represented a further departure from American doctrine. While American special forces often operated in platoon-strength formations of 20 or more men, the Australians favored patrols of 5 to 6 operators who moved through the jungle as a single, integrated organism. These tiny units sacrificed firepower for stealth. A 5-man patrol could move through vegetation that would be impassable for a larger force. They could remain concealed in positions that would be obvious with more personnel. They could communicate through hand signals and glances rather than radios and spoken words. They became, in a very real sense, invisible. The trust required for such small unit operations exceeded anything in American military culture. Each operator had to believe absolutely in the capabilities of his teammates because there was no reserve force to call upon, no quick reaction team waiting to extract them if things went wrong. They were alone in enemy territory, and their survival depended entirely on each other. This trust was built through years of shared training and deployment, through selection processes that eliminated anyone who could not subordinate ego to team, through a culture that valued the patrol above the individual. American forces, with their constant rotation of personnel and their emphasis on individual achievement, could never replicate this level of cohesion. But the true power of this brotherhood would only become clear in the heat of combat. The patience required for Australian-style operations was perhaps the hardest element for American observers to comprehend. American military culture prized action, initiative, aggression, the active pursuit of objectives through the application of force, the idea of spending days in observation, of letting targets pass unmolested, of achieving goals through inaction rather than action seemed almost cowardly. But the Australians understood that patience was not passivity. It was a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. By waiting, by watching, by gathering intelligence rather than engaging immediately, they built understanding of enemy patterns that enabled devastating strikes at moments of maximum vulnerability. A typical Australian operation might spend 5 days moving into position and observing a target, 2 hours conducting the actual assault, and another 3 days withdrawing through enemy territory. American forces, by contrast, might spend 5 hours planning, 2 hours moving to contact, and the rest of the day fighting their way back out after the enemy had been alerted to their presence. The mathematical results of these different approaches were stark. American operations achieved sporadic kills at the cost of regular casualties. Australian operations achieved concentrated kills at virtually no cost. Over time, these differences compounded into the extraordinary statistics that eventually caught the Pentagon's attention. And those statistics were about to become impossible to ignore. The question that haunted American military planners was whether Australian methods could be scaled to the larger American force. Could you train hundreds of thousands of soldiers to move like ghosts through the jungle? Could you replicate the selection process that produced such exceptional operators? Could you somehow acquire the institutional knowledge that the Australians had developed through decades of jungle warfare? The honest answer was probably not. Australian SAS methods depended on factors that could not be easily transferred. The Malayan experience that had shaped their doctrine, the Aboriginal knowledge that informed their tracking, the small unit culture that enabled such tight coordination, the patience and restraint that contradicted everything in American military tradition. More fundamentally, the American approach to Vietnam made Australian-style operations irrelevant. The United States was fighting a war of attrition, attempting to destroy enemy forces faster than they could be replaced. This strategy required body counts, statistics, measurable progress that could be reported to Congress and the American public. The silent intelligence gathering that defined Australian operations produced few headlines and fewer metrics. The Australians were fighting a different war entirely, one focused on controlling territory and degrading enemy capability through psychological pressure, rather than physical destruction. Their methods worked brilliantly for their limited objectives, but could not have been applied to the massive American commitment without a fundamental reimagining of strategic goals. And that reimagining was something that American political and military leadership could never accept. The consequences of this failure would echo for decades. The end of Australian involvement in Vietnam came in 1971, when the government in Canberra announced the withdrawal of combat forces. The SAS was among the last units to leave, having maintained operations until the very end, despite the political turmoil that had undermined the war effort on both sides of the Pacific. They left behind a legacy that would not be fully appreciated for decades. The territory they had controlled remained more secure than any comparable area in Vietnam. The intelligence they had gathered continued to prove valuable long after their departure. The fear they had instilled in enemy forces persisted, contributing to the relative stability of their former sector, even after conventional Australian forces had withdrawn. But they also left behind questions that would trouble military thinkers for generations. If such a small force could achieve such extraordinary results, what did that say about the American approach to the war? If stealth and psychology could accomplish more than firepower and technology, what did that mean for the doctrine that defined American military power? If a few hundred Australians could outperform hundreds of thousands of Americans, what did that reveal about the fundamental assumptions underlying modern warfare? These questions were too uncomfortable for official acknowledgement. The Pentagon classified its studies of Australian methods and ensured that the American public would never learn how badly their military had been outperformed. The Australian government, mindful of its alliance with the United States, never pressed for recognition of achievements that might embarrass its most important ally. And so, the story of the Ma Rung faded into whispered legend, known only to those within the special operations community who had witnessed their methods or studied their results. But the truth would not stay buried forever. The rehabilitation of Australian SAS reputation began slowly in the 1980s, as veterans started speaking more openly about their experiences, and as researchers gained access to previously classified documents. What emerged was a picture of military excellence that challenged comfortable assumptions about Western military power. The statistics, once they were finally released, proved as remarkable as the legends had suggested. The confirmed enemy eliminations numbered in the hundreds, against losses that could be counted on one hand. The intelligence gathered had contributed to operations that affected the entire course of the war in their region. The psychological impact had extended far beyond the boundaries of their sector, influencing enemy behavior throughout South Vietnam. But the most significant legacy was doctrinal. The methods developed by the Australian SAS in Vietnam, the emphasis on stealth, the integration of psychological warfare, the use of small units operating independently, the patience to gather intelligence rather than seek immediate contact, gradually infiltrated special operations forces worldwide. Today, elements of Australian doctrine can be found in the training and operations of elite units from a dozen countries. The British SAS, the parent organization from which the Australian unit was derived, adopted techniques that their offspring had developed in Vietnam. American special forces, despite decades of institutional resistance, eventually incorporated concepts that could be traced directly to the jungles of Phuoc Tuy. The Australians themselves continued to refine their methods through subsequent deployments in East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts that demanded the skills they had first demonstrated in Vietnam. Each operation added to the institutional knowledge that made them arguably the most effective special operations force in the world relative to their size. And the lessons they taught would reshape modern warfare in ways no one anticipated. The final accounting of Australian SAS performance in Vietnam reveals numbers that still seem scarcely credible, more than half a century later. Over approximately 10 years of operations, from the first advisors in 1962 to the final withdrawal in 1971, the regiment conducted thousands of patrols into enemy territory. They eliminated between 500 and 600 enemy combatants by conservative estimates. They gathered intelligence that proved crucial to Allied operations throughout their region. And they lost 7 men. 7 soldiers did not return from a decade of the most dangerous operations imaginable. 7 families received the news that no military family wants to hear. 7 names were added to the honor rolls that commemorate Australian sacrifice in Vietnam. Compare this to any other unit that conducted comparable operations. American Special Forces lost thousands of operators during the same period. Conventional American forces lost tens of thousands. Even other Australian units, operating in less dangerous roles with more support, suffered casualties that dwarfed the SAS losses. The ratio of enemy eliminated to friendly losses exceeded 50-1 by the most conservative calculations. Some estimates place it closer to 100-1. No military unit in modern history has achieved anything comparable. These numbers changed everything, but the Pentagon refused to admit it. The individual stories behind those 7 losses deserve recognition, not as statistics, but as human beings who gave everything in service to their country. Sergeant David Fisher, the only Australian SAS soldier confirmed to have been ended by enemy fire in direct combat, served with distinction for years before his patrol was ambushed in 1969. His leadership and tactical skill had contributed to countless successful operations before that final engagement. The others, those who fell to accidents, to illness, to the chaos of combat where friend cannot always be distinguished from foe. Eager's teams were equally dedicated professionals who understood the risks they faced and accepted them willingly. Their loss was mourned by a tight-knit community that remembered them not as casualties but as brothers. But the remarkably small number of those losses should not obscure the magnitude of their achievement. The Australian SAS did not simply avoid casualties. They actively accomplished missions that would have cost any other force dearly. They operated continuously in enemy territory, engaged hostile forces on terms of their choosing, and gathered intelligence that saved countless Allied lives. Their survival rate was not a product of avoiding danger, but of mastering it. And that mastery would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The lessons of the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam continue to resonate in an era of persistent conflict and asymmetric warfare. The challenges that defeated American conventional forces in the 1960s, an elusive enemy, hostile terrain, a population of uncertain loyalty, have reappeared in Afghanistan, Iraq, and wherever Western forces have engaged with insurgent movements. And in each of these conflicts, the principles that the Australians demonstrated have proven their worth. Small units operating independently have achieved results that massive conventional formations could not. Stealth and intelligence have proven more valuable than firepower and technology. Patience and psychological warfare have accomplished more than aggressive pursuit and overwhelming force. The Americans who laughed at those filthy pigs wallowing in the mud eventually stopped laughing. They stopped laughing when the statistics became undeniable, when the intelligence proved its worth, when the Australians went home having lost 7 men while American forces continued bleeding across the country. But by then, it was too late. The war was lost, the lessons were classified, and the opportunity to learn from Australian success was buried under institutional pride and political necessity. The Pentagon never admitted what those classified studies revealed. They never acknowledged that their allies had found a better way. They never explained to the American public why a few hundred Australian farmers had outperformed the mightiest military in human history. But the truth could not be buried forever. The contemporary relevance of Australian SAS methods extends far beyond military history. into fundamental questions about how modern nations should approach conflict. The American model of overwhelming force, unlimited resources, and technological superiority has proven repeatedly inadequate against determined insurgencies fighting on familiar terrain. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, the pattern has repeated. Massive investment producing minimal results against enemies who refuse to fight on American terms. The Australian model offers an alternative that has received insufficient attention from military planners seduced by the promise of technological solutions. It suggests that human factors, training, selection, doctrine, patience, matter more than equipment budgets. It demonstrates that small forces can achieve strategic effects through psychological impact rather than physical destruction. It proves that stealth and intelligence can accomplish what firepower cannot. These lessons should have transformed American military thinking after Vietnam. Instead, they were classified, ignored, and forgotten as the United States rebuilt its military around the same doctrines that had failed so catastrophically. The result was predictable. Similar failures in subsequent conflicts where the enemy refused to accommodate American preferences for conventional warfare. The Australians, by contrast, continued refining the methods that had served them so well. Each new deployment added to their institutional knowledge, tested their techniques against new enemies and new environments, and confirmed that the principles developed in Vietnam remained valid across decades of changing technology and evolving threats. Today, the Australian SAS is recognized as one of the finest special operations units in the world, a reputation built on the foundation laid in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province more than half a century ago. And their legacy continues to shape modern warfare in ways that most people never realize. The psychological impact of the Ma Rung legend persisted long after the last Australian patrol departed Vietnam. Veterans of the conflict, both allied and enemy, continued telling stories about the phantom soldiers for decades. These stories grew in the telling, as war stories always do, but their core truth remained. The Australians had achieved something extraordinary that conventional military wisdom could not explain. For Vietnamese veterans who had survived encounters with the SAS, the memories remained vivid. Captured documents and post-war interviews revealed the depth of fear that the Australians had created, a fear that influenced behavior far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Entire units had avoided the Australian sector whenever possible. Local Viet Cong infrastructure had struggled to maintain morale in areas where the ghosts were known to operate. This psychological impact multiplied the military effectiveness of the tiny Australian force many times over. Every enemy soldier who hesitated, every unit that chose a longer route to avoid the cursed ground, every commander who deployed additional security rather than risk engagement. All of these secondary effects contributed to Allied success without costing a single Australian life. The Americans achieved similar fear through different means: the awesome power of B-52 strikes, the terror of napalm, the overwhelming destructiveness of artillery concentrations. But this fear was diffuse, affecting the general population as much as the enemy forces. The Australian approach created targeted fear, focused specifically on those who threatened them, leaving civilians largely untouched. Which approach was more ethical remains a matter of debate. Which approach was more effective is not. The verdict of history is clear. The final word on Australian SAS performance in Vietnam belongs to those who witnessed it firsthand. American Special Forces operators who served alongside the Australians returned with stories that challenged everything they had been taught about warfare. Their classified reports, fragments of which have now been declassified, paint a picture of military excellence that has few parallels in modern history. One American Green Beret, whose after-action report was finally released in 2009, summarized his experience with characteristic directness. He wrote that before embedding with the Australians, he had believed American Special Forces were the finest in the world. After 6 weeks with an SAS patrol, he understood that belief had been arrogance born of ignorance. The Australians, he continued, operated on a level that he had not known existed. They achieved results that seemed impossible. They moved through environments that should have been lethal as if they belonged there. They controlled the jungle in ways that American forces, for all their firepower and technology, could never match. And they did it with methods that he could describe but not fully understand. Methods that seemed to tap into something older and deeper than modern military science. His recommendation, classified for decades, was unequivocal. The American military should study Australian methods intensively and incorporate their lessons into special operations doctrine. The cost of continuing with current approaches, he warned, would be measured in lives that need not be lost, and missions that need not fail. His recommendation was ignored. The studies were classified, the lessons were forgotten, and American forces continued paying the price that the Australians had shown could be avoided. The Ma Rung are gone now, those original phantom soldiers who haunted the jungles of Vietnam. Time has claimed most of them, as it claims all warriors eventually. But their legacy endures in the doctrine they developed, the methods they perfected, and the example they set for generations of operators who followed. They proved that a small force of exceptional soldiers could achieve results that mass armies could not. They demonstrated that psychological warfare could accomplish more than physical destruction. They showed that stealth and patience and intelligence could defeat enemies that firepower could not touch. And they did it while losing only 7 men in a decade of the most dangerous operations imaginable. The Pentagon laughed at those filthy pigs wallowing in the mud. They laughed until they saw the numbers. Then they stopped laughing, classified everything, and pretended they had never seen the truth. But the truth had a way of emerging eventually. And now, more than half a century later, the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam stands as testament to what a few exceptional soldiers can achieve when they are properly selected, properly trained, and allowed to fight on their own terms. 7 men lost, hundreds of enemy eliminated, an entire sector controlled. A legend created that persists to this day. "Look at those filthy pigs," the Pentagon colonel had said in 1967, dismissing the Australians with contempt born of ignorance. He was not laughing by 1971. Neither was anyone else at the Pentagon who had seen the classified reports. The Ma Rung had taught them a lesson that American military culture still struggles to accept. Sometimes the most primitive methods are the most advanced. Sometimes the smallest forces achieve the greatest results. Sometimes the warriors who win are not those with the most firepower, but those who understand their enemy most completely. The Australian SAS understood, and they proved it in the jungles of Vietnam, where they lost only 7 men, while becoming the most feared force in the entire war. The Pentagon laughed. History did not.